The wind was a restless spirit in that high, lonesome country, a dry whisper that scoured the rust-colored mesas and carried the scent of dust and dying things. It peeled the last light from a bruised twilight sky, leaving the world in shades of charcoal and bone. Under that fading glow, a single cedar post stood stark against the horizon, a gnarled finger pointing to a heaven that had long since looked away. Tied to it was a woman. Her name was Dolores. The rope, thick and merciless, bit into the flesh of her wrists, strung high above her head, until her shoulders screamed with a fire that had burned down to numb embers hours ago. Her hands were bloodless, her ankles bound so tightly she could not shift her weight without the hemp grinding deeper. The cotton of her dress, once the color of sun-baked earth, was now a tapestry of grit and fear torn along her thigh in a jagged line that exposed the taut, sun-browned skin beneath. The neckline sagged, a cruel invitation to the cold that was sinking its teeth into her. She breathed in shallow, measured sips, hoarding the air against the panic that threatened to rise like bile in her throat. She had been left here as a sacrament to the wolves. A cousin's greed, a lie whispered into the right ears. The reasons were ash in the wind. The truth was a currency no one in her band would trade for. They would not come. That certainty was a cold, smooth stone in the pit of her stomach. She had made a vow to the unforgiving sky. She would not weep. She would not beg. She would meet the teeth in the dark, standing tall. In the scrub below the ridge, shadows detached themselves from the deeper twilight. Yellow eyes gleamed. The wolves were patient. They paced in a slow, tightening crescent, their paws making almost no sound on the hardpan. When the wind stilled, she could hear the dry rasp of their breath. Miles south, a man rode through the badlands, a solitary figure moving through a world that had forgotten him. His name was Jack Thorne, but the trail had long since worn it down to just Lonesome Jack. He rode a pale buckskin named Ghost, and they moved as one creature born of the silence and the dust. He wasn't headed anywhere in particular. He was just headed away. Away from the memory of a cavalry uniform folded in a chest, away from the faces of men he'd guided into ambushes, away from the smell of black powder and the low moan of a woman dying in a clean, quiet bed. His wife, Clara. He carried her memory like a blood-stained handkerchief tucked in his coat pocket, a thing he could neither look at nor throw away. He was just moving because the rhythm of the horse was better than the suffocating stillness of a rented room. Then the sound reached him, carried on that same restless wind. The drawn-out, overlapping howls of a wolf pack. It wasn't the sound of a hunt, it was the sound of a vigil. Something had them gathered, focused, waiting. Jack nudged Ghost with his heels, his hand falling instinctively to the worn stock of the Winchester and its scabbard. He saw the post first, a dark slash against the fading sky. Then he saw the shape tied to it, a fragile line of defiance against the vast emptiness. He saw the flutter of torn cotton, the spill of black hair in the wind. He reined Ghost to a halt 100 yards out, the setting sun glinting off the brass of the cartridges in his gun belt. The wolves were closer now, their patience wearing thin. Jack slid the Winchester free. The action was a smooth, oiled whisper of sound, a prayer he knew by heart. He didn't aim for the wolves. He aimed for the dirt just ahead of the boldest one, a big gray male inching forward. The rifle's crack was sharp and violent, a sound that tore the fabric of the twilight. The bullet kicked up a plume of dust, and the wolf scrambled back, startled before melting into the brush. A second shot sent whining over the head of another was enough. The pack dissolved, becoming whispers and shadows once more. He dismounted, the rifle held loose in his right hand. His boots crunched on the gravel, a steady, deliberate rhythm. He scanned the ridge, his eyes missing nothing. Trouble was already here. He just had no mind to invite more of it. Up close, she was younger than he'd thought. Her face was a mask of exhaustion and grime, but her eyes were alive. They were dark, deep pools of defiance, and they were watching him, measuring him, weighing him on a scale of horrors to see if he was a lesser evil than the one that had left her. He smelled the dust on her, the faint human scent of sweat and fear. It was a smell he remembered from other places, other times. He slid the rifle onto his shoulder and drew a long, sharp knife from his belt. Stepping close, he could feel the faint warmth radiating from her body, a stark contrast to the biting cold. He put the blade to the rope at her wrists. The hemp parted with a soft sigh, and as the tension gave way, he saw the raw red lines the bindings had carved into her skin. Her arms dropped dead weights and her body sagged with them. She would have collapsed onto the unforgiving ground, but he was there. He caught her in arms snaking around her waist, pulling her against him. For a moment, she was all sharp angles and trembling warmth pressed against the solid wall of his chest. He felt the stutter of her breath against his neck, heard the faint involuntary gasp as his hands spread across the small of her back. She was real. She was alive. The moment held for a heartbeat too long, charged with a current that had nothing to do with rescue and everything to do with the simple, shocking reality of a human touch after an eternity of cruel rope. Then her jaw tightened. She pushed away from him, finding her own footing, her pride a shield she raised between them. Jack said nothing. He crouched, slicing the ropes at her ankles, then stepped back, giving her the space she so clearly craved. He unhooked his canteen and offered it. She watched his hand, his face, then took it. The water was a sacrament. Some of it trickled down her chin, tracing a clean path through the dust on her throat. He pulled the heavy sheepskin coat from his saddle and draped it over her shoulders. It swallowed her small frame, smelling of horse and smoke and him. She clutched it closed, her knuckles white. The wolves were still out there, a rustle in the dark, a promise of what could have been. Jack tilted his head toward Ghost. She understood. He lifted her, his hands firm on her waist, settling her into the saddle before swinging up behind her. His arm came around her to take the reins, his chest, a solid presence at her back. He could feel every tense line of her body, the chill of her skin, even through the layers of cotton and wool. They moved off the ridge, leaving the empty post like a forgotten gravestone. Neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the weary creak of saddle leather, the steady, rhythmic beat of Ghost's hooves, and the wind that whispered through the sagebrush, telling tales of dust and desire, and the dangerous solace of a stranger's arms in the new scent. Encroaching dark. The canyon swallowed the last of the light, pulling the cold, deep blue of night down over them like a shroud. Jack held Ghost to a steady walk, his body a shield against the worst of the wind that funneled through the narrow rock passages. He could feel the woman Dolores leaning into him now, the initial rigid posture of defiance slowly surrendering to bone-deep exhaustion. Her head rested against his shoulder blade, and the subtle weight of it was a thing he hadn't felt in years. It was a heavy weight, a dangerous weight. He kept his senses sharp, listening to the night. The silence that had settled was different now. The wolves were gone, but that didn't mean the two-legged kind were. A woman left for dead often had men who wanted to make sure the job was finished. He scanned their back trail, seeing nothing but stone and shadow. His cabin was tucked into a deep fold of the canyon wall, more a part of the rock than a structure built upon it. A low-slung roof of sod and timber, a small empty corral, and a neat stack of firewood were the only signs of human life for 50 miles. A thin ribbon of smoke forgotten from his morning fire still clung to the air. He swung down from the saddle, the familiar ache settling into his bones. He reached up for her, his hands finding her waist again. As she slid down, her legs gave way, a sudden boneless collapse. He caught her, his hands tightening her body, slumping fully against his. For a moment she was all soft weight and the scent of sage from her hair. He felt the quick, shallow beat of her heart against his ribs. His own breath hitched. It was an intimacy born of necessity, but it sparked something low and warm in his gut, a fire he thought had long ago burned to ash. She recovered quickly, pulling herself upright, her face hidden in the shadows as she steadied herself against the saddle. Inside the cabin was one room spare and clean. A cot against the far wall, a small table with 2 chairs, shelves holding tins and jars, and a pot-bellied stove that was the heart of the place. Jack barred the heavy wooden door, the sound of the bolts sliding home echoing in the sudden quiet. He took off his hat, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "Sit," he said, his voice a low rasp in the stillness. He gestured to the cot. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if testing every muscle, and lowered herself onto the rough wool blanket. She kept his coat wrapped around her, a fortress of leather and fleece. Jack filled a tin cup with water from the bucket by the door and handed it to her. Her fingers brushed his as she took it, a brief, fleeting touch of chilled skin against his calloused knuckles. The small shock of it made him pull his hand back faster than he'd intended. In the lamplight, he could see the marks on her wrists clearly now. They were angry, swollen welts, the skin broken in places. He said nothing but went to a small wooden chest and pulled out a clean strip of linen and a bottle of whiskey, the good stuff saved for snake bites. And nights when the ghosts whispered too loud. "This'll bite," he warned, his voice softer than he meant it to be. He knelt before her, pouring a little of the amber liquid onto the cloth. He reached for her hand. She flinched but didn't pull away. He held her wrist gently, his thumb resting on the pulse point just below the raw skin. Her pulse was a frantic bird beating against his touch. He dabbed the wound and she sucked in a sharp breath, her jaw clenching, but she made no sound. He worked with a practiced stillness, his movements economical and sure. He cleaned the other wrist the same way, acutely aware of her dark eyes, watching his every move, trying to read the lines on his face, trying to decipher the man behind the quiet competence. When he was done, he wrapped both wrists in clean linen, his fingers lingering for a second longer than necessary on the knot. The air between them was thick with unspoken things. He could feel her questions pressing in on him. He stood and moved to the stove, needing the distance. "I was checking old trap lines south of the ridge," he said, answering one of the questions without her having to ask. "Heard the pack. They sounded stationary. Figured something had him cornered." He met her gaze across the small room. "Wasn't expecting to find you." Her eyes dropped to the floorboards. A long silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind against the cabin walls. Finally, her voice came low and gravelly from disuse. "You could have kept riding." It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. "I could have." He agreed, his back to her, as he stirred a pot of beans. Didn't seem right. He served the beans on 2 tin plates, and they ate in a silence that was less about caution now and more about a shared exhaustion. When she was done, she watched him, her gaze unwavering. He pulled another blanket from a shelf and laid it at the foot of the cot. "You take the bed," he said. "Floor's fine for me." Her eyes searched his, looking for the catch, the price of his charity. She found none. He took his coat and spread it near the door, settling down with his back against the rough-hewn logs the Winchester laid across his lap. He began to clean it by the dim light of the single lamp, the rhythmic metallic scrape of the cleaning rod a familiar and comforting sound. In the quiet, he heard her lie back, the creak of the cot's ropes loud in the small space. He didn't look at her, but he could feel her watching him, her gaze a physical presence in the dark. He knew trust wasn't a thing you could earn in a single night with a canteen of water and a clean bandage. Trust was a slow-growing plant in a hard country. But tonight the door was barred, the walls were solid, and the woman on his cot was alive. For a man who had long ago stopped looking for reasons, it felt dangerously close to being enough. Just before sleep claimed him, he heard her whisper a sound almost lost to the wind. "My name is Dolores." He didn't answer, but her name settled in the quiet room, a seed planted in the dark, waiting to see if it would find purchase in the barren soil of his life. Jack woke to the pre-dawn gray, a chill creeping through the chinks in the cabin walls. He moved with the quiet economy of a man accustomed to solitude, stoking the embers in the stove until they glowed back to life. Only then did he glance toward the cot. Dolores was awake, her eyes open in the gloom, tracking his every movement. She was wrapped in the blanket like a cocoon, a small still form in the vastness of his bed. "Sleep any?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "Some," she replied. The word was cautious, a carefully measured offering. He poured coffee into 2 mugs, the aroma filling the small space. He set one on the table, a silent invitation. She swung her legs over the side of the cot and came to sit across from him, the blanket clutched around her shoulders. Her dark hair was a wild tangle around her face, and in the growing light, he saw the faint yellowish edge of a bruise high on her cheekbone, a shadow the lamplight had hidden last night. He had to know. The danger she was in hadn't ended at the cedar post. "The ones who left you," he began, keeping his tone even. "They'll come looking, if they hear you're alive." Her gaze met his over the rim of her mug. There was no fear in her eyes, only a cold, hard certainty. "Yes." He waited, letting the silence draw the story out of her. "My cousin Esteban," she said, her voice flat. "He wanted my father's rifle, a Springfield. When I refused, he told the elders I'd been selling myself to surveyors from the railroad. He said I brought shame on our family." Her jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing beneath the skin. "He has always wanted what was not his." "And they left you for the wolves on his word alone?" Jack asked, a low anger simmering in his gut. She gave a single bitter nod. "His word is law now." He made sure of it. It was a story as old as the dust, a tale of greed and power. But hearing it from her, seeing the ghost of the rope marks on her wrists, made it new and sharp. "Then we make sure he doesn't find you," he said. It wasn't a promise, it was a statement of intent, a line drawn in the dirt. Later that morning, he stepped outside to check on Ghost and saw them. Hoof prints in the thin layer of frost, not his own. 2 riders. They hadn't stopped, but they'd passed close enough to see the cabin, close enough to wonder. He went back inside, his face grim. Dolores saw it instantly. "What is it?" "Riders," he said. 2 of them. Passed by in the night. She stood a little straighter, the blanket falling away, to reveal the worn cotton of her dress. "Esteban's men. One has a scar on his cheek, a knife cut from a card game. His name is Wyatt. The other Silas, he wears an old cavalry coat, even in the heat." Jack filed the details away. "A scar and a blue coat. Things you could see from a distance. They know I'm here now," he said, more to himself than to her. He picked up his rifle, the weight of it familiar and reassuring. "Means we stay put for a while." The day unfolded in a series of shared, unspoken rhythms. He showed her how to work the bolt on the door, where he kept the spare cartridges. She in turn took a piece of salted pork and a handful of dried beans and made a stew that filled the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. At one point he was splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a counterpoint to the silence. She came to stand by the woodpile watching him. The wind caught a strand of her dark hair, whipping it across her face. He stopped, axe resting on the block, and watched her push it away. Her hands were raw and bandaged, but they were capable hands. "Can you use one of these?" he asked, nodding toward the Winchester, leaning against the cabin wall. "My father taught me," she said. That afternoon he took her to a small sheltered box canyon behind the cabin. He set a tin can on a rock 50 yards out. He handed her the rifle. It looked heavy in her arms, but she held it with a familiar ease. She raised it to her shoulders, sighted, and squeezed the trigger. The report echoed off the rock walls, and the tin can jumped into the air. She worked the lever, chambered another round, and fired again, her movements fluid and sure. He watched her, and something shifted inside him. This was not a frightened victim he had rescued. This was a woman forged in the same hard country as he was. She was a survivor. As she lowered the rifle, a faint smile touched her lips, the first he had seen. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows for a brief, breathtaking moment. Their eyes met, and the air crackled with a new tension. It was no longer the tension of 2 strangers thrown together by violence. It was something else, something deeper and far more dangerous. It was the recognition of a kindred spirit, a spark of understanding that passed between them without a single word. The shared smell of gun smoke, the echo of the shot, the wildness of the canyon, it all braided together into a single, potent moment of connection. That night, as he settled onto the floor, his coat for a pillow, she spoke from the darkness of the cot. Why, her voice was soft, but it carried across the small space. "Why are you doing this, Jack?" He stared up at the shadowy ceiling for a long time. He thought of Clara's handkerchief in his pocket, a symbol of all he had lost. He thought of the men he'd left behind. "Because I've ridden away from trouble before," he said, his voice a low growl of self-reproach. "I'm tired of the view from the back of a horse." He didn't know if she understood the weight of his confession, but when he finally closed his eyes, he felt her gaze on him, not as a question, but as a quiet, steady presence in the dark. The cabin no longer felt like his solitary refuge. It was becoming something else, a fortress, a sanctuary, a home. And that thought scared him more than any 2 riders in the night. The frost on the ground meant the tracks would stay sharp, and they pointed the way straight to his door. The 3rd day dawned with a deceptive peace. The air was still and cold, the sky a vast pale canvas. Jack felt the quiet in his bones. It was the hush before the storm, the deep breath a predator takes before it strikes. He moved through his morning rituals, coffee, checking the corral, scanning the horizon with a coiled tension that was becoming his new normal. Dolores was